I'll now call on the registrar to read the minutes of the last public business meeting.
An ordinary public business meeting of the Phil was held on the 22nd of January 2015 with President Sarah Mortell in the chair. So since the last public business meeting, the SU election campaign season begun on campus, serving solely to boost the confidence of some insecure freshers who happen to get asked to be on a team. And you can track their smiles slowly fading over the course of Monday as they see 80 other freshers also wearing the Conor O'Mara for President t-shirt. And they realise that maybe he was just being disingenuous when he Facebook mailed them and said that he really trusted them and they'd be crucial to his campaign. And maybe that 800-word request in Facebook chat wasn't originally written, and maybe it was just a copy and paste. There being no further business, the meeting adjourned.
Are there any objections to me signing these minutes as a true and accurate, I must say rather amusing, record of the last public business meeting? There being none, I shall duly sign. Well, welcome everyone to the Phil this evening, where the motion up for debate is: this House believes that a language that needs preserving isn't worth preserving. I now call on President Sarah Mortell to explain the standing orders for this debate.
Okay, so good evening everyone. So the standing orders for tonight's debate are as follows. So speeches are a maximum of 7 minutes in length. In terms of protected time and points of information, after the first minute of each speech, there will be a bell. And after this point, members of the floor and other speakers in the debate are free to offer pieces of information. And I would ask you all to keep these a maximum of 10 to 15 seconds in length. And if you refuse, please sit down. For the last minute of the speech, there will be another bell which sounds very similar, like this. And at this point, no more points of information shall be offered, and then the speaker will begin to wrap up their speech. Audience participation is highly encouraged, and if you agree with something a speaker is saying, please feel free to say you're here. And if you disagree with what a speaker says, please feel free to say shame. In terms of oratory returns, a reminder to fill out these which are on the chairs of each individual audience member, and this goes towards the gold medal of oratory at the end of each year awarded to the speaker who gains the highest mark. Just a small kind of amendment in terms of your oratory return sheets. There's a replacement, so instead of Katrina Lee Green, we have our own lovely James Wilson. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it back over to our chair.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Without further ado, we shall start the debate. And our first speaker in favor of the proposition is Luc Daly-René, who is a junior sophomore student of human genetics.
Just going to make sure my laptop doesn't fall down in mid-speech. All right. Good. Good to go. A country without a language is a country without a soul. Padraig Pearse always had a flair for the dramatic. He was also fond of coming with all sorts of rubbish. I'm going to talk to you through why languages which need to be propped up should be allowed to die, why individual freedom is more important than preserving an irrelevant language, and why fewer languages can lead to a better world. Now, first of all, because I'm setting up the debate, I'm just going to clarify that this debate happens in several different contexts. The most immediately obvious one to us is in Ireland, where we try to prop up that our particular national language and have it taught in schools. But this discussion also happens in areas like India, where Hindi, which is supposed to be the national language, is spoken by less than 40% of people, and also groups and tribes across places like Nigeria and both the Americas. But the thing is, I'm not going to focus on them too much because their language is usually our last priority for preservation, because their basic safety and human dignity is usually not being preserved either. You can feel free to come back at that. Now, my first point is about why we shouldn't try to prop up languages essentially. And the thing is, like, as far as I'm concerned, the kind of preservation we're talking about is top-down, like, government-mandated preservation of a language. We teach it in our schools, we force people to parrot, like, Innishdom for, like, 6 years in primary, then we make them sit it for, like, the junior cert and the leaving cert, and they get no real say in it. What I'll say about that is that quite frequently this preservation isn't natural, this isn't a language that people actually desire to speak. So, I mean, what's actually really interesting about Irish, and the Irish that we speak today, is that it's as constructed a language as Esperanto. Because what happened was, De Valera decided that he wanted to have people speak a certain form of Irish that didn't actually reflect who we were at the time. And so as a result, it was about as fake as his idea of maidens dancing at the crossroads. And what you see when governments like our Irish government and the Indian government try to promote their own idea of what their cultural language should be is an extremely reactionary kind of movement. It's no mistake that Fianna Fáil is the biggest pusher, and if there's a bigger Irish politics, it's probably one in office with Labour at the moment. So, like, essentially, the way that I think we should look at this is not to try and promote a stasis of language, not like governments try and tell us that we should speak a language that is no longer relevant to the populace. I think, I mean, I got the plug there that I'm like a junior sophomore student of genetics. I'm a big person for evolution and organic things. And I think culture is organic and constantly evolving. And I think that Irish's interaction with English, which is the language, one language we're all speaking here, otherwise you can't understand what I'm saying, it results in new linguistic forms in response to need and the demand of the people who speak it. And when a language is no longer an effective means of communication, then it falls by the wayside and is something we speak any longer. So I think we get something a lot better when we allow language to be dictated by the needs of the people, rather than people who want to force us to have a certain national identity. I'll get back on that. Secondly, the idea of individual. So this doesn't refer quite as much to Ireland, but more to places like, say, Bangalore in India or anywhere else, where a language that you're taught to speak from a very early age doesn't necessarily correspond to your day-to-day life or the kind of life you want to lead. So over in India, less than 40% of people speak Hindi. The language that is predominantly spoken, if you want to be successful, if you want to go to college, is English. So what English provides to a lot of people, like a couple of my friends over with Suez, to teach English over in the Sundarbans, which is another kind of small rural area in India. And the attitude there is that if you learn to speak English, you will have access to success. So that means that, for one, you are able to travel more freely because you will be able to be understood whenever you try to speak to people there. You will be able to get a job more effectively. You can get education more effectively. You have access to a whole variety of things you would not have if you were forced to kind of martyr yourself in order to keep a language alive. I think that, on balance, the benefits to an individual are so much higher when you allow them to actually speak a language that matters to them, in terms of their freedom of movement, their political capital as well. If you're an oppressed group, it's a lot easier to engage with the language of people who are in power, rather than to try and use your own, like, diminishing and declining language and not being understood as a way to try and gain political capital. It just doesn't make sense to me. The other thing is, like, globalization relies to a certain extent on people being able to communicate with each other. Like, if you get them to communicate with each other when they don't understand each other, you get back to, like, pointing and grunting and stuff, which is a level that I thought we'd kind of grown beyond by now. So I think it's a lot better if we can kind of use that. And that's also going to be my third point. First of all, if anyone wants to give me a point of information, that would be great.
So, like, your bit about, like, death, like, and like making a new language, isn't that just evolution? Except you kind of just prod it up, like when you breed dogs, and it makes it more.
Like, cultural change is very rarely what we would call organic and natural. Like, this is like, it's not so much breeding dogs together and trying to, like, have a national identity you want to buy. Sorry, so I'm mixing up metaphors there. It's we're not trying to breed, like, you know, the best dog or whatever. Like, in this case, it's more like bombarding, like, mice with radiation and seeing what happens, because, you know, you're just kind of interested and, you know, damn the people who actually have to deal with your messed up language. That's kind of cool. Now, third point, right? So what I'm probably going to hear out of, I thought I was speaking later on proposition, so I thought I'd have stuff to respond to. So a lot of my points are like, well, here's what Op said. So I'm just so a lot of stuff gets made of, like, a unique cultural perspective that you have access to when you have language, the whole not having a soul thing, right? I want to kind of come back at that by saying that, one, a unique cultural perspective utterly useless if you can't interact with the broader world or engage with it to produce a new art, and you're relegated to some sort of very rural, very lonely existence where you can't express yourself. The other thing is, look, there are 6,000 languages in the world at the moment. I think that nobody can really learn more than 5 or 10 unless there's some sort of genetic freak. So, like, that's not even going to affect that many people in the first place. I also think that the collaboration of billions of people to produce art who can all understand each other is much preferable. It'll reduce a lot of the kind of tribalism and self-separation that we have to deal with in day-to-day life. Like, I mean, I think when everyone can kind of relate to each other on the same grounds, rather than needing 3 translators to allow the Dalai Lama to speak to Chinese people, like, that's probably like a better way to ensure that we get cooperation and kind of a unified world spirit. Like, the Tower of Babel wasn't a parable of how it's great when nobody can understand each other. I think it would have been a lot better if we could have actually built that tower, climbed up, and given the finger to the face of God. I think that's something that stands to human achievement a lot more. Also, getting back to Tirgan Changa, Tirgan Anam, I can't really speak Irish. The people who want to opt into a country, like immigrants who are coming in, cool, can't opt in when they're told that they can't interact with the soul of the country when they don't speak its language. That shuts people out and it kills multiculturalism and globalization. That's better for the world. Don't prop up dying languages. Thank you very much.
Right, now, got the ball rolling. So in opposition, the first speaker is Christopher McMahon, who is a junior freshman student of law and political science.
Okay, so as this is your first time speaking in the Phil Chamber, you are afforded what we call maidens' rights. So maidens' rights basically mean that if you waive your maidens' rights, you'll be offered points of information from the floor or our audience members, and if you choose to keep your maidens' rights, then you won't be offered any of them. So what do you choose to do?
Rights happily waived. Ladies and gentlemen, the motion before this House today threatens to transform all of the colonial and economic exploitation that has so marred human history into a modern-day cultural hegemony by destroying what's left of the world's linguistic diversity. And today I'm going to show you that linguistic diversity and the values of tolerance and peaceful coexistence that it entails are things worth having in society. Things that are so much so in fact that we should be willing to spend some degree of resources, some degree of our wealth in achieving them, in protecting minority and marginalized languages. And in sort of explaining that, I'm going to be dealing with 2 main problems that we have on this side of the House with the proposition's arguments. And these are, first of all, the idea that there exists such a thing as a language that doesn't need preserving or doesn't need protecting. And secondly, that their misappraisal of the value of a language and the kind of benefits that we gain from a language. So turning to the first of these, a lot of what we've heard from the proposition today rests on this sort of dichotomy, this distinction that they draw between 2 groups of languages, between languages on the one hand that are invincible and that can stand by themselves, languages like English or French or Arabic, Chinese or whatever else, and languages that they compare. Languages that they, the beggarly and parasitic languages of Irish and I don't know, Native American languages, Aboriginal languages, or whatever else. Languages that they have a quarrel with because they see them as achieving the same role as any other language, but with the added cost of preserving them. And this is doubly unfortunate, partially because it makes me talk about languages as though they're people and are invincible or strong or weak, and partly because that distinction that they're drawing isn't a real one. It doesn't actually exist because there's no such thing as a language that doesn't need preserving. All languages are embedded within human interactions. They can't exist independently and depend entirely on conscious human action in order to support and perpetuate them. No, thank you. So the difference, therefore, doesn't lie between languages that don't need preserving, but rather between languages that have received a whole lot of protection and a whole lot of preservation measures and languages that haven't, like Irish. So the patterns of subordination, so this kind of explains the patterns of subordination and dominance that we see in sort of languages on a global scale. languages like English have sort of enjoyed so many sort of active attempts to put them in the international position that they are. We don't think that this is an organic process, but something that somebody has consciously tried to bring about. Because English has benefited enormously from the fact that it was part of a colonial administration that brought it to new territories, that brought it to new populations, and made it the language of status, wealth, and power in these new regions, and gave people incentives to speak it. And that kind of, those kind of benefits, those kind of conscious attempts to perpetuate the dominance of English still happen now in the modern day because of sort of the globalized world we live in, and kind of the way capitalism works means that we're starting to see regional specializations in terms of labor, such that there's a lot of countries like those in Africa, and even Ireland in sort of the not too distant past, countries that spend most of sort of where most of the population rather is engaged in producing large amounts of cheap raw materials that only have any meaningful value added to them after they're sent on to Europe or to wealthier countries to be further processed. So what this means is there's inequalities in the world. It sort of diverts wealth towards one particular, to a smaller group of people, or to one particular region. And when you give one group of people all the wealth, all the status, and all the power, their language necessarily becomes the language of wealth, status, and power. So we say that really these kind of patterns that exist between and dominant languages are created by conscious action. It's not an organic process, as the proposition are trying to tell us it is. So, no thank you. We're already working so hard to continue to preserve English and preserve the dominance of all these particular languages. So the question isn't whether or not we should waste our time and energy preserving languages, but which languages we want to preserve. And while the proposition are going to tell you that you should only ever preserve languages like English and French, languages that we should continue to preserve just because we've always preserved them. But on the opposition side, we would rather say, yes.
Well, like, it isn't just that they should be preserved, it's that people wish to preserve with them and engage with them. Why is that choice invalid? Why should we wrap up languages people don't want?
Because the choice that was made, the choice is sort of forced on people. This is not sort of a nobody sort of had this nice collective sit down and said, I would like us all to speak French. Rather, the French colonial administration arrived and makes everyone speak French. It's not as simple a choice as the proposition think it is. And on the opposition, we would rather say that in choosing how many languages to preserve and which languages to preserve, the answer should be as many as possible. Because we think that each language isn't just a tool. It's not just a means of communication like the proposition think it is, but it is part of how people see the world and themselves. And we think that if it is part of culture, that it deserves to be preserved in its own right, because for the same reasons that we're willing to invest in and promote the arts, to promote the theatre and literature and all these other aspects of our culture, for the same reasons that we invest in those kind of things, we should be willing to invest in language, which is just another part of that culture we want to protect. But beyond kind of the individual merits of each language, we think that having more languages in the world is better because it sort of promotes diversity and it promotes diversity and sort of it works to counteract the suggestion of the proposition that if languages don't fit into this sort of global scale of efficiency, or cultural practices don't fit into this global scale of efficiency, that they need to be removed. And we think that that kind of suggestion is it sort of debases culture and ultimately makes social cohesion a lot harder to achieve in more ethnically diverse societies. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, we say that we need more languages across the world and within each society, because we think linguistic diversity is worth having because it's been a catalyst for great social change. Because when we see that revolutions like the Renaissance have been born out of a diverse cocktail of languages of Italian, Turkish, Greek, and Latin that coalesced in the 13th and 14th century Italy, and the mixing of different viewpoints that were represented by these different languages, when we see that, ladies and gentlemen, when we see these great social revolutions put forward by linguistic melting pots, we think we're missing a trick in letting languages die. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to oppose.
Next speaker is Siddharth Vijayfari, who is a junior freshman student of Business Economics and Social Studies.
So first of all, a very good morning, a very good evening to all the members seated in this house, and a very good morning to all the pack of over-ambitious people seated on my left of the opposition. Trust me, it takes special courage to defend something that is simply light years away from all the realms of practicality. First of all, let us be very clear about what preservation of a language actually means. Broadly defining, preserving a language effectively means to integrate a language into the system by external means, with the intention of regaining its popularity as an actively spoken language, just the way it was before extinction. Or for that matter, artificially widen the demographics within which an endangered language is spoken to delay its extinction. Now, even as I speak, this entire process seems nothing else than nonsensical in approach, and in the due course of my speech, I shall explain as to how it is neither viable nor feasible to do so. Firstly, I shall talk about how languages themselves as an entity are terribly transient. Now, if we analyze the historic trends that various languages across the world have followed, it is more than safe to say that almost all the languages on this planet come with an expiry date. Having said that, the main purpose of a language is communication, and a language can only be quantified by the number of people it allows one to communicate with. Given this quantification, it is absolutely preposterous to put in the extra mile to artificially revive the languages that have completed their due course and now inch towards extinction. Thank you. It is, of course, enriching to learn other languages and delve into different cultures, but it is enriching not because all those different languages and cultures are unique, but because making contact across those barriers of language and culture allows us to expand our own horizon and become more universal in our outlook. Moreover, if a language is actually on the verge of extinction, it means that it is losing its native speakers, clearly implying that it is a part of a select few people's cultural identity and shall cease to be part of anyone once extinct. Then how does it make sense to panic about the loss of cultural identity when the only people facing that loss are already dead? All the languages have a right to die and a right to not be killed. If a language is dying, not because it is suppressed, but because the native speakers yearn for a better life, then we should respect that right and let it die in peace. Speaking a language such as English, French, or Spanish, and discarding traditional habits can often open up new worlds and is often a ticket to modernity. Moving on to the second point of my speech, let us talk about what preserving a language actually entails. Now, being an economics student, if I analyze this step in terms of opportunity cost, which is what you give up in order to gain something, unsurprisingly, preservation of a language shall fall in the lowest spot. The reason being that to revive a particular language, it is necessary to have thousands of speakers actually speaking that language. Out of 6,000 languages present today, 3,000 are spoken by no more than 200 people. This process and this concept of actually keeping a language alive in its last stages is completely skewed because it is simply against the rule of nature. Make no mistake here that this is in no way interfering with the individual rights or a group of rights or a right of the group. The reason why languages like Sanskrit or Ayak are on the verge of extinction is not because the last speakers have been denied their rights, but because there are no more speakers actually capable of or willing to speak that language. However, if, as the case has been at times, languages are not dying but are actually being killed by one party which wants to impose its cultural imperialism over another, we should vehemently stop that forceful imposition, and the decision to whether the language should be spoken or not should rest with the native speakers and not with the state. If the native speakers are in no mood to preserve the language, where is the sense in spreading precious resources to save a language which already has one foot in its grave? Sometimes a desperate attempt to preserve a language will only prolong the pain before the language dies, wasting the objective and the precious resources. Now, this isn't to say that miraculous recoveries do not happen. They occasionally do. But the reason why you hear about them is because they are so statistically improbable. For the vast majority of languages nearing extinction, such a recovery is less likely than winning the lottery and getting struck by the lightning on the same afternoon. Also, a dead language necessarily doesn't need to be completely forgotten. It can be used for academic purposes, it can be historically documented, and it can be used to further the cause of linguistic patronage. And this has been best exemplified by Greek and ancient Latin. But to preserve a language is a different ballgame altogether. And the contemporary argument for preserving linguistic diversity presented by the opposition draws and stems from the same philosophy that gave rise to the ideas of racial difference. This is the same philosophy which embarked upon the belief that different people have unique interpretations of the world, which, despite best intentions, was the fundamental belief for racial division of the world. Speaking of examples, let us talk about the Irish language. Now, I know this is a very sensitive issue to discuss, but if we actually picturize the Irish language from a third-party perspective, it's quite pitiful, to be honest. As someone coming to this country from a different continent altogether, it is more of a patent fact to recognize and connect Ireland as one of the perennial English-speaking countries of the world. Now, it is not actually until the airport immigration that many people like me realize that Irish indeed is a proper language in itself. Now, the opposition might question my general awareness for such a lapse in information, but in all fairness, the truth is that Irish language is only limited to signboards and alternate public announcements, which are really weird, by the way, and everyone taking the rules will second me on that. On one hand, the Irish government is taking steps to ensure that the cause for which the martyrs of 1916 died remains alive by integrating the Irish language into the system right from the school curriculum to the public scriptures, while on the other hand, it is leaving no stone unturned to consolidate its position as a major English-speaking country in the European Union when it knows that UK is not actively participating in continental trade. With no offense to any of my Irish colleagues, this is simply a case of a government exhibiting sheer double standards. As on one hand, they want to grow multinational American companies with low taxation and a broad English-speaking base, and on the other hand, they want to appease the public by floating this national sentiment of the very own Irish language. I'm pretty sure the guys at the immigration are going to revoke my visa status after the speech. But coming back to the government, this would have been justified had either Irish been the first language of the majority of Irish population, or it would have been a language with global speakers. But unfortunately for the opposition in my left, neither is the case. And henceforth, the entire effort and resources that are being spent by the government to uplift the Irish language is nothing but an eyewash to sway the people into a false sense of national security. And the fact of the matter is that there is hardly a significant population which actually speaks Irish. But neither am I saying that everyone should speak English either. Some people in the opposition might tend to take a destructivist view and argue that everyone will be soon speaking English. But it would be of interest to know that my mother tongue Hindi, as was mentioned in the first proposition, has only days ago topped Mandarin as the most widely spoken languages in the world after English. And also Spanish is growing fast. In short, there is no need for hand-wringing. Language is not a plant that rises and falls, lives and decays. It's a tool that is perfectly designed and shaped by the people and adopted by the people who use it. Thank you.
Second speaker for the opposition then is Colin Monet, who is a junior freshman student of law and political science.
So as Colin, you are also a maiden speaker, you are for maidens' rights. So do you choose to keep these maidens' rights and take no consideration from the floor, or do you choose to waive them and receive a rapturous round of applause?
I wish to waive them and also rapturous round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen of the University Philosophical Society, Luchthussel and Common Gaelic, ladies and gentlemen, I strongly oppose tonight's motion, not purely because I am a Gaeilgeoir. Echoing the words of our dear beloved leader, Enda Kenny, tonight I'm not a speaker Gaelic per se, but a speaker that happens to be a Gaeilgeoir. Although tonight I fear that the odds are stacked highly against us. Not only are we from the Common Gaelic speaking away from home, I can genuinely feel the disapproval and years of oppression wafting down from the portraits. We are also debating in your language, which means something that I'm going to have to ask you to bear with me during the speech. As when one debates us Gaeilge, we can genuinely just say anything we want because nobody understands us. To be fair, isn't that really the sole purpose of the Irish language then? So we can talk about you in front of you. The Common Gaelic meetings are actually just preoccupied with finding new ways to diss your hairstyles and looking around the room tonight. I think we're going to have a lot of new material. So I'm looking forward to that. I think we can presume, or since I'm here, that tonight's motion is based on the Irish language primarily. However, I'd like to begin by saying that this motion to be loaded somewhat in this respect. To say that the Irish language needs to be preserved intimates a sort of archaic, crumbling facade, not progressing, but in a battle to maintain its mere existence. This could invite a degree of contempt from my learned colleagues in the proposition, who might lead you to believe that the struggle that they paint to desperately preserve our native tongue merely results in postponing the march of time and the eventual demise of the language. Ladies and gentlemen, I can assure you that this is not the case. Despite whatever figures thrown at you regarding expenditure on the Irish language tonight, please do not accept that the struggle is in vain. It is not money down the drain. Surprisingly, I don't vote for Sinn Féin. Moving on. Regardless, the number of Irish speakers has been constantly growing in recent times, with the census in 2006 showing an increase of 20,000 Gaeilgeoirí in Dublin alone during the preceding 4 years. The proposition's argument that our language isn't worth preserving, that it isn't worth the funding, the time, or the care, as it is a dead language, are grossly mistaken. I mean, this motion is based around the conflict between the romantic and the pragmatic. As you may have noticed, I'm no Connemara diehard. I'm not from the Gaeilge militia. I don't burn copies of the Oxford English Dictionary for sadistic pleasure. I prefer a worldview of the Irish language that doesn't have to be parochial or associated with nationalism, republicanism, or dancing at the crossroads, but the language as a bastion of cultural diversity, identity, and indeed communication. I was born and raised in Dublin. Therefore, I can admit that promoting the Irish language in the heart of the Pale was challenging at times growing up. I was subject to insults and slurs from other children when I was heard speaking Irish, even at times racial abuse. You Irish scumbag, from another Irish person. I mean, I was genuinely just confused. Why, therefore, did I continue to speak the language? Unlike, however, my friend mightn't agree with me, he was saying, from an early age until today, I have been surrounded by young, energetic, like-minded metropolitans who believe in the necessity of the Irish language, who understand its importance as a cornerstone of our identity, and who are convinced of its significance in our future. I accept that money has been spent on the Irish language. Yes, it is harder to justify expenditure on a language rather than roads, building, or transport, as the results are harder to see. But to discontinue the support of our own native tongue would only result in embracing pragmatism wholeheartedly in favour of the romantic. It is difficult for us to argue notions of idealism, but for the proposition to lobby for cold efficiency and cutting out any aspect of life that they cannot see any immediate use for is dangerous territory. To argue that nobody uses Irish anyway is, in my opinion, a lazy argument. The same could be said of differential calculus, poetry, dare I say, philosophy. The Book of Kells, Mona Lisa, La Pieta, would these philistines fling them into the scrap heap, install a skip outside the National Museum, the Ardagh Chalice, sure nobody even drinks out of it anymore anyway. In our world, one language dies every 14 days. With each death, a wealth of knowledge and identity has been lost. Neoliberal politics of globalization has become unchallengeable, as you mentioned. However, have we stopped to calculate the damage that this causes? Globalization does not promote a multiplicity of cultures, but in fact a conformity to the selected few, breeding stifling homogeneity and uniformity. I understand there is a place for globalization, I mentioned. However, this notion doesn't mean that there is such a thing as bilingualism, with everyone in this room who has Gaeilge would be myself. We're not talking a protectionist sort of view of the Irish language that only Irish can ever be spoken again. Not only does the Irish language deserve to be preserved, it is our duty. Let us not forget that the demise of the language as the primary source of communication in the country came about not through free choice, laziness, nor contempt on the part of the Irish people. It was recognised by the colonising British Empire as the essential ingredient of the Irish identity, and they subsequently endeavoured to banish it from the land, murdering those speakers who defied them and grinding the remainder into submission. The language was stigmatised as a barbarous tongue by the oppressing British, associated with poverty, deprivation, and famine. Following our independence from the Crown, post-colonial lack of confidence cast a long shadow over the nation's psyche, as the Irish people became embarrassed by the association that our own language brought about. If the Irish language was consciously and willingly rejected by our nation's people, then even I would find it hard to justify its preservation. But it's not natural evolution, as you were saying. It was proactively extinguished by an oppressing conqueror, and we owe it not only to those generations past, but to the generations that are to come to preserve and develop the language so that they can understand our uniqueness, our identity, the soul of the nation. Current neoliberalism stands before us, however, as the new oppressing conqueror. Is our country a country tempered in the fires of idealism, union activism, culture, heritage, romance, now such a slave to the marketplace that anything not worth monetary value is deemed superfluous and not worth preserving? Culture costs money, but in the absence of culture, we are trees without roots. What separates an Irish person from an English person? 2 arms, 2 legs, and inability to tan. Language gives us character, identity, a sense of belonging. Must we remove each facet of our lives that isn't profitable? Then let us shut down the nursing homes, the charity shops. Each facet of our lives that requires support, clear out the nursing homes. Each facet of our lives that needs preserving, then let us march outside and tear apart the Book of Kells, page by crumbling page. Please support side opposition from
Next speaker then, in favor of the proposition, will be Sophie Donnelly, who is a junior freshman student of politics, philosophy, economics, and sociology.
Chamber, I would like to offer you your ladies' rights. So do you choose to keep these rights or waive them and give a massive round of applause? Of course, waive them.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the University Philosophical Society, ladies and gentlemen. I have four main points to race through today, and basically all in the Irish context because I did my names last year, so it's all I know. And basically, firstly, it's the opportunity cost the Irish language. Secondly, I'm talking about cultural elitism and class divides. Thirdly, the historical chip on the shoulder that is borne by side opposition. And then finally, the economics of a dying language. I'm sorry, I'm tough to talk about economics, but that's my degree, so yeah. Firstly, to get on to the opportunity cost of the Irish language. Okay, so opposition has basically failed to recognise the scope of the opportunity cost created by devoting such ludicrous amounts of time in secondary schooling to the teaching of the Irish language, okay? While our international counterparts are being provided with strong foundations in science and technology, in economics and in maths, which are like the STEM subjects, from an early age, at ages 4 and 5, we are shackled to this language which we will never use, which we will grow to basically despise, and then we will promptly forget, like literally 8 months after the Leaving Cert, I can barely speak it. Surely this time would be better spent teaching modern languages, enabling Irish children to broaden their horizons and thus engage with the diversity of international cultures. The powers that be continue to support the mandatory teaching of Irish in schools, and thus the government is reinforcing Irish insularity, further isolating us on this island from the international community, hindering our progression and potential, all for the sake of some higher ideological standard that is put by opposition, so we can reel off Kupla Fuckle or bitch about strangers on holiday without them knowing, which is basically the only reason that people, the only use that people can find for the Irish language, because it's literally useless. Okay, so frankly, it's scandalous that the generation after generation are saddled with redundant language while their peers across the world spend equivalent hours advancing knowledge of STEM subjects. All the while, these areas are being cut by government cutbacks. How can we justify this? So secondly, cultural elitism and class divides. So there's this cultural elitism associated with proficiency in the Irish language, and this translates very strongly into cultural alienation of immigrants and those with learning difficulties, creating barriers in education and in integration. So Luke touched on this point, but just to elaborate, by contesting that the Irish language remains in the 21st century a cornerstone of culture, not only are the opposition living in a state of self-delusion, they are tacitly excluding thousands of families who, through no fault of their own, cannot speak a word of Gaeilge. There's so many harms which arise when a language becomes a preserve of the educated cultural elite, and when this language becomes inextricably intertwined with the possession of cultural capital. In the education system, the forced imposition of the Irish language upon students leaves immigrants at a major disadvantage. They're confronted with difficulties of assisting their children in learning a language which they have no experience and no exposure to. Many, there's two I think, kind of derivative points from this. So this means that immigrants, many of them sit Irish at ordinary level, they forfeit 40 CAO points automatically. This can mean the difference between university degrees or even university and college, and while others for whom the challenge of learning this language is just simply insurmountable, they drop it altogether, and that means that they've less choice doing their CAO. I didn't leave this last year, but I just think about CAO still all the time. And then we're also talking about the emergence of selected Gael Scoilna. So Irish language schools. Migrants are basically precluded from applying to these academically prestigious, predominantly in Leinster especially, middle class, highly selected schools that consistently perform well on league tables. And so by all of us joining in and kind of lauding these schools as paradigms of academic excellence, We are complicit in this propagation of monoculturalism, ladies and gentlemen, because there's only one culture going into these schools, and it's white, and they speak Irish. Okay, so having not been socialized into this language, non-nationals face yet another barrier to integration in this country. The preservation of Irish in the education system reinforces our national isolation, educational disadvantage, and exclusion of diversity. Yes.
I'm not saying when people say that we should be speaking Irish, I'm not saying forget English forever. Like by pushing the Irish language or preserving the Irish language, people are not going to forget every single English word as well and not be able to communicate.
No, I'm not saying that, but the fact that the Irish language still, like, it's not like we are forgetting every point of English, but like the Irish language in our culture is still being forced upon us. It's being pressed, and its importance in an education system especially is just so huge that you're putting people that are coming into this education system from foreign countries or have dyslexia and cannot, like, don't speak Irish or just don't take Irish. You're putting them at a major disadvantage, and that like can actually like be exaggerated throughout the rest of their lives as a result of forfeited CAO points. Okay, so I'm going to move on to my third point, which is the historical chip on the shoulder. So Luke mentioned that this natural process of the evolution, that languages come and go. Okay, so we're not denying that the circumstances surrounding the arrival of English on our shores was basically like colonial imposition of this language and like by a colonial foreign aggressor. However, keeping the Irish language on life support in defiance of this fact is a task that's doomed to fail. So the continued preservation of the Irish language is one of the greatest manifestations of misplaced, out-of-date nationalism. The remnants of a bygone era that are peddled to students who literally count down the days till Maureen Cossack, Peg Sayers, and Spalpeen freaking Fauna are out of their lives forever. Surely it's testament to the strength of the Irish culture that we've maintained a strong national identity, like despite speaking English. The English language also provides us with the opportunity to spread and proliferate the Irish culture abroad. I mean, this would be unimaginable if, like, us little 4 million people in comparison to the 7 billion, if we all spoke this language that no one recognized and no one understood. We don't need to keep alive Irish national solidarity and pride, leaving Irish, like, we need to leave Irish to die a dignified death, and that is not a denigration or an admission of defeat to the English. It's an acknowledgement of our progress. It's an acknowledgement of the role that Irish language played in our past and our current strength of cultural heritage despite adversity. So quickly on to my final point, the economics of a dying language. So firstly, it's like inescapable the fact that millions of euro of taxpayers' money is plugged into the translation and printing of official documents, road signs and maps, which are used by so few people, yet we continue to shove money and resources at this redundant black hole of Irish language bureaucracy. Secondly, like money invested in the deadweight losses of Irish language broadcasting, like the only reason that TG Caher has half decent viewing pictures because unfortunately it possesses the rights to like broadcasting good sporting events. I, for one, and I know most people do this, I watch like Wimbledon Bio on mute to escape these feelings of inadequacy that after 14 years of education, we still can't understand what the commentator is saying. It's just a monotonous stream of like gibberish. So for many in authority, the Irish language has become something of like the sacred cow. It's untouchable due to the votes that it earns in rural Gaeltacht areas, employment created in a self-sustaining, self-serving industry that contributes very little to Ireland's economic and political capital. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, if whether or not the Irish language will survive without government funding is really up to a small, tiny minority of native speakers in rural Gaeltacht areas that speak it, and they can flog that dead horse till the cow like quite literally come home, ladies and gentlemen. If you support the preservation for the sake of preservation, the alienation of immigrants, the kindring of Irish students internationally, the spending of tax revenue on loss-making Irish language products, holding on to historical grudges and sustaining a dying language on life support, then by all means oppose this motion. However, if like me you believe in modernity, cultural equality, ease of integration, diversity and progress, I beg you, propose.
Things are heating up. And our next speaker now from the opposition will be Hannah Fall, who is a junior sophomore student of English literature and French.
You are also afforded Ukraine's rights. So do you choose to keep these rights or do you choose to waive them and go hard for the round of applause?
Ladies and gentlemen of the Philosophical Society, I'm here today to to oppose the motion that a language that needs preserving isn't worth preserving. I will make particular reference to the Irish language and to the necessity for its survival. The Irish language is an integral part of our cultural identity. Retaining its use enables us to preserve this identity. However, the need to preserve this marginalised language does not stem merely from its cultural connotations. It may be the first official language of Ireland, but this does not afford it a guaranteed and infinite survival. Rather, it is the will of the people to speak the language that calls for its continuance and for its preservation. According to research carried out by the 20-year strategy in support of the Irish language, the majority of the Irish population view their native language in a favourable light, deeming its continuance to be of both personal and cultural benefit. This internal support for the language is exemplified through the education system. Some may say that this internal support merely stemmed from the language being made obligatory in primary and in secondary schools. What is the credibility of a language that is learned, at least initially, on account of its being made compulsory? However, like any other obligatory subject, some students enjoy learning Irish and others don't. The same applies for maths, English and history. It is fundamental to afford students the chance to make their own decision as regards their native language. Phasing it out due to a supposed lack of desire to learn it is not enough, for the simple reason that there is a desire to learn Irish. And as to the assertion that immigrants find it difficult attending English schools to learn Irish and that they feel excluded, they have even more difficulty with learning English if it's not their first language. The number of students attending Irish-speaking schools are growing, with 6.4% of students outside of Gaeltacht attending Gaelscoil now. Irish is not obligatory as a field of study in our universities, yet many students choose to study it. It is the responsibility of the state and of the education system to preserve the mediums through which Irish can be taught. Irish, like any other academic subject, deserves to be taught where there is a desire to learn it. Like any other field of study, it warrants expression through an academic and legitimate medium. The will of third-level students to study Irish gives strength to the assertion that languages in decline are worth preserving. The ambition of students to graduate in Irish, causing the education system to satisfy their demands. Moreover, the Irish language is taught in over 30 universities worldwide, whereby many non-Irish students choose to learn the language. This also enables people of Irish origin living abroad to maintain their link to Irish culture and heritage. The universal demand to learn Irish in itself makes our language worth maintaining. People choose to learn our language and thus to preserve it, not only in our own country but further afield. This is not a case of preserving a language simply in light of its cultural standing. This is a case of responding to the demand of those who call for the continuance of the language. The 20-year strategy for the Irish language has been in operation since 2010. Its aims are to increase the numbers of Irish speakers in our country and to offer support to those in the Gaeltacht. However, the question is not the methods which are being taken to preserve the Irish language, but rather whether it is worthwhile to preserve the Irish language at all. There are over 6,700 languages spoken worldwide today. UNESCO reports that over half of these face the threat of dying out before the century ends. These languages call upon us to make the effort to preserve them. Are they worth preserving? What is the point of preserving marginalised languages? The same threats that face these languages are also applicable to the Irish language. Irish was the tongue of the majority until 1800, after which period it has been subject to decline and marginalisation. Languages such as the French francophones face the threat of marginalisation, and many more are likely to diminish. Is any language infinitely protected from being forgotten in place of the world's most commonly used languages? We face the very real threat of subjecting language to mass generalisation by failing to preserve marginalised languages. Our culture will suffer alongside our native tongue. Our history and our heritage is inseparable from our language. The 20-year strategy for the Irish language asserts that Irish is the oldest spoken literary language in Europe. The Irish language is first recorded in history as part of the Ogham inscriptions of the 4th century AD. A significant range of literature from the 10th century exists in Middle Irish. The Ulster Cycle is part of this body of work. Thus, our historical culture is at least partly embedded in the Irish language. Preserving the language means that scholars will continue to analyse these works in the language in which they were originally written. This maintains the authenticity of such works and the status of Irish. Moreover, it supports our history and our culture. If Irish is deemed as unworthy of preservation, the likelihood is that the value and relevance of historical documents, such as the Ulster Cycle, will diminish. Nicholas Ostler, the chairman of the Foundation for Endangered Languages, claims that when languages are lost, most of the knowledge that went with them gets lost. People care about identity, people want to be different. But nowadays we want access to everything, but we don't want to be thought of as no more than people on the other side of the world. The generalisation of language, particularly in light of the mass spread of English, threatens the identity of a nation. Irish culture is inseparable from the Irish language. Remembering our language is central to analysing our history, in which the Irish language plays a key role. The value of preserving the Irish language extends far beyond its historical status. Those wishing to find employment with the Irish language often find their opportunities restricted to within Ireland. However, this does not reduce the esteem of such jobs. Working with the Irish language relates to working with our native tongue in order to pass it on to others. Television stations such as TG Cahir fundamentally aim to promote the language. Workers in more accessible fields such as the teaching of Irish ensure that the language is acquired by younger generations. Is there a point in working to preserve a language merely to ensure its survival? However, the work of TG Cahir and the teaching of Irish stems far beyond the endangered position of the language. The continuance of the Irish language ensures that it will be passed on to future generations who deserve to make their own choices as regards their use of the language. Attempts to preserve the language have met with success. The 2006 census revealed that 1.2 million people use Irish at least occasionally. This figure has increased to 1.3 million people in 2011. Up to 30,000 people use Irish as their first language in the Gaeltacht. The fact that people choose to live in the Gaeltacht and to speak Irish is the essential point. These people express an interest in living and in speaking through the medium of Irish. If anything, this interest has been rejuvenated as of late. The growth in summertime Irish language schools proves the essential point that young people want to learn Irish. This alone calls for its preservation. Although it is fundamentally our second language, citizens express a will for the preservation of Irish. Regardless of its marginalised status, the continuance of Irish has been met with interest and support, both in Ireland and abroad. The act of preserving the Irish language has been and continues to be met by the Irish government. This is not a case whereby a language is preserved merely in light of its connection to our culture. Our language merits preservation for the fundamental reason that people express a will for its continuance and continue to call for its preservation. Thank you.
Now, the fourth and final speaker in favor of the proposition is Glenn Byrne, who is a junior sophomore student of law.
The last time I stood up here, I read from 50 Shades of Grey. I like to think that speech had some bearing on the decision to make a movie, but maybe not. But I thought this time around I'd take more muted and appropriate start to the debate and just begin with a debate on language, as I think it's important, especially why the minority languages, especially Irish, are not as important as we feel or as side opposition feel that it inherently is. As such, my major point is why language, specifically endangered languages, have no inherent value in and of themselves. So the main point that seems to be put forward by my side of the house is that communication is fundamentally a tool. It's a tool for society in which we exchange ideas and such. And what the side opposition failed to address is that they failed to respond to that aspect of the argument and instead respond in the more cultured argument that says that language is fundamental to a culture. But the basis of a language is in of itself communication, and failure to communicate inherently fails on the idea of a language in the first place. So then what value is left in a language, and what more specifically, what value is left in an endangered language such as Irish? So moving on to the cultural aspect that seems to be so fervently put forward by the opposition. First of all, they seem to propose that language is fundamental to a cultural identity in a given state or country or nation. However, death of a culture inherently results in the death of the language of that culture, but it's not necessarily the same way around. If a language dies, the culture itself does not die. In respect to Irish, the fundamental benefit of Irish seems to be entrenched in the historical aspect of that language, in the sense that Irish relates to our history as a nation. But separated from that, where is the value in Irish? We argue that there is no such inherent value, and in a vacuum, that language can't survive. That language can't survive as a value in and of itself that's worth preserving. And secondly, as such, the value of a language is left in understanding the historical context. That's why we learn language. That's why we learn the Irish language in school, so that we can understand books like On Trial or even further predated to that. However, in the resource argument, the socioeconomic argument that was put forward by my side of the house, where is the value in making the compulsory nature of a language a part of the school curriculum when that aspect of learning the language is only an academic aspect? If the demand is there, then yes, that should be promoted, but it shouldn't be promoted in positive action by the state, and that's just a fundamental waste of resources. Instead, those should be directed elsewhere. If academia and understanding history is the only aspect of a language that we feel is the reason for preserving a language, then that's not necessary enough. That's not valuable enough to make the certain policy decisions that we make necessary in our current society. Along that thread of cultural diversity, the opposition seems to be purporting the idea that cultural diversity is also inherently a good thing. Now, we accept that cultural diversity is a good thing in certain respects. For example, the cultural diversity between things like architecture or things like food is beneficial. You know, we benefit from the different types of such aspects from different cultures. The reason being is that it stops the homogeneity of society, but it also allows for new perspectives, and it reacts against the monotony of globalization. However, in relation to language, we don't feel that that is necessarily a positive thing. The reason being is that language as a form of communication, as I aforementioned, was that it's the exchange of ideas. And so if we push for like the exclusivity of a minority language, then where's the exchange of ideas that is fundamental to the promotion of cultural diversity? We feel that that's not the case if we continue to perpetuate, I'll take it in a second, if we continue to perpetuate the idea of minority languages being fundamentally and inherently valuable. We're not pushing for the exclusivity of a minor language. I mean, we are pushing for bilingualism, and as I said, I mean, people in France, I mean, they speak French, but they also seem to perform very well in the global markets. When they have immigrants coming in, they don't have any problem with that. Even though they speak French the whole time, they speak German.
Yeah, in addressing that, now, a justification for preserving an endangered language is a reference to the fact that a small minority of people speak that language exclusively and why that's necessarily a good thing. But in response to your point, it's not good that that we value that one or a small group of people speak a certain language exclusively. Instead, that alienates that group of people from the rest of society, and it stems any cultural diversity in that respect. Other languages, as you referenced to French and stuff, that, as I said, that mainly falls within the first point, that it's a tool for communication. And if a language fails in its primary function of communicating, then what's left is the culture has really addressed the cultural argument to the extent that needs to be necessary in justifying the preservation of languages such as Irish, or even other languages such as Manx from the Isle of Man. I'd also like to lastly address the idea that preservation of language can actually be an abuse of the language in and of itself. So the idea of, for example, my main reliance being on the Irish language, to keep pace with modernity, that Irish language has to adapt. But as that language adapts and it becomes, I guess, twisted by the dominant language of society, that it perpetuates the hegemonic aspect of English or another dominant language, enforcing itself upon that language, instead allowing the language to essentially die out, like other dead languages such as Latin or ancient Greek, still preserve the historical aspect of that language. And if that wants to be studied, if the demand is there, then that should be accommodated for, but it shouldn't require a positive action by the state, and therefore a further twisting of the language to the point that it is not related to the language that it historically was, even though opposition say that the historical context is fundamentally important. The opposition have also put forward the idea of I guess a revenge argument that Irish language is a nationalist thing, but that argument we feel is a bit dated and it should be a bit more modernized. I guess because my speech is coming to a close, I should finish with a phrase that I think, an old Irish phrase that I think really puts into significance the uselessness of our current Irish language.
Legan is Gormuk, the screwed for pair. Around liquid A.
Now, our final speaker, last speaker for the opposition will be James Will, who is a senior scholar, history and French, and a bit of a gymnast as well.
I have no main rights to wave. Okay, so, ladies and gentlemen, Tommy Anasasta a vet on shot and up Gaharha Motal Slew all war on Gum Kanosh. So like it's a very nice place for me to like sort of probably do my last speech and debate in Am because the filler here, the common here. So it's kind of a meeting of minds, and I'm very happy to say to both society, thanks for a great 4 years, and it's you two that have sort of made it for me. So really nice.
I don't know what you're saying.
I'll tell you later. Okay. So like when I was first called to participate in the debate, you know, like 5 minutes before it started, I was like, okay, well, so I just staying there. So like I think it's mainly going to be a summation speech. So I started, you know, writing down what people said. So the first thing I started was I wrote a note to Glenn and it said, "Oh, what a lad. Just look at that sports bottle Luke Daly Renane's got on the podium. Hashtag lad." But then I actually got down to the actual business of the debate. So anyway, I started being like, so Luke talked about individual freedom and a better world. And I was like, oh, classic history. Well, individual freedom. And he's like, Irish is fake. But Irish is only fake if Italian is fake. Because what I learned in A-level history is Italian was only made when they united Italy. So if you're from Sicily and you speak to someone in Milan, you have difficulties understanding you. So when they first created it, they were like, no, we must make Italians. And the first rule is we must make a language. So that's when Italian was made. They did the exact same thing. I assume they left out the awkward Donegal part of Italy and just made a better language. So, Intok, Marshiv. Okay, so like governments tell people to speak Irish only when they're in school, and like we tell you to do lots of things in school. So like we tell you to do maths, we tell you to do science. Does that oppress you? It oppresses me when I have to do it. But like you guys can take Irish, like literally, it's so Intok or fart. So like, as I said, Luke, it's like evolutionary breeding. So like interact with the rural, poor Catholic. Someone's got a bit of chip of his shoulder. I know he's from Wicklow, so he obviously feels just a little bit of shame being in Dublin, like, oh, I'm not metropolitan enough. Well, like, I'm sorry, I'm from the countryside and I speak Irish, but not the countryside you're thinking of. Like, I've also been poor and Catholic, and I can tell you, I wasn't baptized because my dad hates the Catholic Church. He wouldn't even marry my mum in the church, and that really upset my grandmother. Different story. So I can tell you now, I'm not baptized, I'm not a Catholic, and I'm not poor, pretty middle class. So like, anyway, okay, watch me learn. And he was just like, oh, no one can learn more than 10 languages. Like, watch me, Luke. Okay. So then we get to immigration kills multiculturalism. What about multiculturalism within Ireland? You are oppressing Winch na Gaeltachta, Luke. You are like capitalism for the Gaeltacht. You are terrible. So like, that point doesn't stand. Okay, and then we have the best. Sorry, discarding traditional habits is great. Okay, well, if we were doing that, then we'd all be like twerking in the club. It's actually dancing. So like that point doesn't stand either. Now I'm going to turn the page. Okay, so like Irish is limited to signage. Well, Tafalcha Road with Ocod, War, and Common Gaelic. That you can come to a Common Gaelic night any night you choose, or even come to the Shkame where I live, and like we'll speak Irish to there. I think like Claire summed up the spirit in the Shkame of Urwan when she was just like. He was like, do you ever speak English to her? And she was just like, oh, once when I was really tired, I was falling asleep and I said something in English. And like my flatmate said something really like passive aggressive when she was just like, fair enough. Which means English. So like English is out in this game. And like, no, I don't speak English to my flatmate because that's why I'm getting the drop. Dollar bills. Has to market itself. So Ireland has to market itself as an English-speaking country. Like, that's not true. France markets itself as a French-speaking country. It does perfectly fine. So does Germany, which moves me on to like, Colin wrote me this note, like, in France, French is spoken, in Germany, German is spoken. And like, for some reason, I got this, like, I've only ever spoken Irish to Colin. And like, for some reason, when I speak Irish, people think I'm Irish. And like, did you go to Clash Owen? I'm like, nope. But so I was just like, I just had this incredible like need to out myself. And I just wrote really guiltily on my speech on like this piece of paper, do you know I'm English? And he just nodded at me. And like, that was, you know, like almost as nerve-wracking as coming out. Okay. We're live streaming this to like a group on Facebook, which is called Gaeilge One, which is Irish only. And I often get like, so like once I had a really argumentative argument with someone about Scottish independence, obviously I was taking the unit side, and like, they don't know that because they're from the rat. And like I get a note from the admin and I post a link to like a poll, which is obviously it's like, it's Gaeilge One, Anna and group, need Gaeilge One, like it's a piece of bear now. Okay, really sorry. So like, Díomh Acáirde, Fáilte Díomh Díospóirte, Cláisne Tnoide, na Banrín Eilish a Hain. So like, yeah, okay. Then we get on to Sophie, and she's like, oh my God, you made to study Irish. I'm like, I hate maths, and I was made to do it. And it's like, engage in diversity of international culture. Hun, diversity starts at home. Like, so anyway, then she was just like, immigrants exclude them. Well, like, immigrants are clever people, hun. They're like intelligent enough to be able to like get around an immigration system, you know, learn another language, come to Ireland. So quite many. You don't take any of my POIs. So like, they're quite clearly capable enough to like learn a language to come here. I don't think they should be patronized and say like, oh my God, you just can't learn Irish. You're too like foreign to do it. It's just too hard. Just because I can do it, sorry. Sarah's like, so anyway, 4 CEO points, like if they do know Irish, that means they've been here since they were at least age 10. Like, you know, it's an academic subject. They're probably as able as us, I hope. So Gaelscoill, they're middle class. You should have come to Gaeilge costings. Lynn was like, I didn't have the opportunity to do Irish well, blah, 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 blah. I'm from Tala, but I sent my daughter to Gaelscoill, and that was great. So like, that's not middle class, because she isn't, she says. So anyway, votes in rural Gaeltacht areas. Like, okay, so like their own interest, and none of us ever do that. That's outrageous. And then Glenn's like, tools for expressing communications. This is my last point. Like, Glenn, you can talk about anything in Irish. If you speak Irish, that's communication. But I can still talk to you in English just because I speak Irish. So tá Fionn and Shin, it is equivalent. And DNC Shakasha of Viogran, the last DNC we had, he's like in prom, he's like, James, so like, I love Conra na Gaeilge, which is the Irish speaking pub. And I was like, yeah, Fionn, I know. Like, anyway. So then he was just like, but like, is this like, I would hate it if loads of English people came to Conra na Gaeilge and sort of diluted the atmosphere. Is it okay for me as a straight man to be here in promo? Does that like dilute the gayness? Should I leave? And I was like, nah, Fionn, tá tú an ar fád, just like being sin agus oh. Like, so that was grand. It's exactly like that. We can communicate about anything we want in Irish, and it doesn't exclude like the fact that we speak English. Bilingual people are far more intelligent than other people because they're practicing with brain cells. So like, I've already learned that it delays Alzheimer's. I'm gonna keep going with Irish just because I don't want to get Alzheimer's. So like, Sinead Acáirde. So like, thank you to the Cumhaill Gaeilge for 4 fantastic years. Thanks to the Phil for 4 fantastic years. Thanks to Glenn for a great year and a half. Like, guys, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for all coming tonight. Like, if you're in first year, as involved as you can in societies, you make the best friends, you have the best time. That's what Trinity is all about. Like, you know, even if you're not speaking Irish and accept some of you don't want to. So like, literally, guys, like, go to the reception, let's hang out, let's have a good time. Thank you so much. And like, whatever side I'm up, aren't I? Yeah, please vote for that side. For Mila Margaret, agus Slanish.
Being entirely neutral. Thank you very much to all their speakers for their wonderful comments. It really was a great debate. I have to make an admission. I've been here in this college for 35 years, and I've never been to a field debate. And I'm very sorry. I really want to thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed this. I have more to say later, but in the meantime, I will now put the motion to the floor. All those in favor, I'll state the motion just in case you don't have it. The motion is, this House believes that a language that needs preserving isn't worth preserving. So, will all those in favor of that motion? Aye.
Aye.
And will all those against that motion say nay?
Nay.
I think the nays have it. I think the motion fails. If I could just make an observation of the arguments. The arguments were fascinating because they range on a number of things. Some of them have to do with utilitarianism. There is this issue of whether you call it opportunity costs, or cost of value, or efficiency, about language and language as a tool, language as a means of communication. I think one of the things which this debate shows is that language is much more than a means of communication. Because the people on both sides were not just communicating to us, they weren't just giving us information, they were swaying us, they were affecting us, they were making us feel particular things. This emotive quality which we attribute to language can't be priced in the same way, with all due respect to the economists. It's a different thing. And I think that's something that came across on both sides of the debate, is that language is not only a tool or a means of communication. So can you actually measure it in terms of efficiency? I don't really know. I will say, you might have guessed from my accent, I didn't grow up in these islands. I did spend a lot of time in school studying maths. I've never used it since, other than a little bit of arithmetic. I wish I'd spent that time studying Irish. It would have been much better. I'm sure I would be using it much more if I had. It's only a personal view. But I also wonder why there's so much emphasis on people should be studying science subjects, things of utilitarian value, etc., as if languages do not have a value themselves. I do not understand that, because I do believe you can actually never know too many languages. And if you want an interesting and little-known instance of the value of languages, which I put together partly through tradition, comes in the Old Testament story of the Book of Esther. You may recall, if you know the story, there's a man named Mordecai, who tradition has it knew 80 languages. Mordecai was the kind of fellow who hung around in a number of different places. A pivotal incident in the story happens because he happened to overhear two people plotting against the king. They thought he didn't understand. He told the king what had happened, and various things happened and people were saved as a result. And the only reason why this happened was because he knew 80 languages. If you can aspire to that, I think you're doing well. And I think, James, you've set up a challenge to more than 10, so if you can do 80, good for you. Before coming here, though, just as a point of sobering thought, I was reminded, I was thinking about the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. He made an interesting observation. It was Bauman's view that once a community starts to praise its unique valor, wax lyrical about its pristine beauty, and stick on nearby fences wordy manifestos, calling its members to appreciate its wonders, and telling the others to admire them or shut up, one can be sure community is no more. So it is a question. It is a question. I think that for those who believe that, and there seems to be a majority here, who believe that it is worth preserving languages that need to be preserved, I think there is definitely an emotional feeling. I think there is a practical feeling. I think there is a great deal on that side. But if we take Bauman's warning, there is also the possibility that those efforts may not succeed. Perhaps, to paraphrase Samuel Beckett, the real answer to this is, as far as languages go, I can't go on, I will go on. So, good luck to everyone. I believe now we come to some final announcements. So, Sarah, for more announcements.
Thank you very much. So firstly, a massive thank you to Professor Callan this evening, our distinguished guest chair, for his wonderful and insightful chairing. And although it is your first Phil Debate in 30 years, we would like to hope that it's your first of many. So massive round of applause for and we would like to thank them for their help, and we're delighted for working in collaboration for this debate this evening. And if you are as inspired as I am this evening, I would encourage you to all go talk to their chair, Mr. Fiona D, or the debate convener, Ashling, and who will be inside in reception. So massive thank you and a round of applause for Uncle Wayla. And tell us all the wonderful things we're doing wrong and recite all of their wonderful times that they had in the society. So the motion before the House tomorrow or next Thursday is this House believes that the artist has no responsibilities. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you back to our wonderful chair to adjourn the meeting.
Thank you very much. Kind words. Am I allowed to say one other thing? It just popped into my head with the coming ballot. I subscribe to a news feed that provides information every day on a countless number of languages. We might get 12 news items about what's going on in India, South Africa, the US, all over the world. Today, just before I came to this meeting on this feed, which is read by people all over the world, what did I get? Only a large announcement of the hustings that were held by the Cumann Bhealach. The description is all in English, I'm afraid. I'm sure you know the piece I'm talking about, but I thought, what a wonderful thing. All over the world, these people are now reading about what happened on the Learning Hall steps in Trinity College. So well done. Having said that, it's my pleasure now to call this meeting officially adjourned.
Is there the event?
Just picking up.
Hey, Chris, these events and stuff.
I'm an officer.
Thank you.